Abdiel Class were an unusual group of ships that served in the Royal Navy during World War II. In the 1930s, the Royal Navy had been pondering a problem. Mines had proven quite effective in World War I, but advances in technology posed something of an issue. The Royal Navy had 5 potential avenues for mine laying available to it if it wanted to mine enemy waters, using cruisers, destroyers, submarines, aircraft, or merchant ships. Existing dedicated mine layers were small, slow, and designed to lay defensive minefields away from enemy interference. However, of the main options that were available to them, a converted merchantman would be very obvious off most enemy coasts where, unlike the UK, shipping could be highly controlled and would be relatively infrequent in a time of war with Britain. Aircraft couldn't lay that many mines, they were quite vulnerable to being shot down, and the Royal Navy didn't have control of anything especially large in any case. They'd have to ask the RAF. Submarines could carry mines, but were again relatively slow and somewhat vulnerable to passive as well as active countermeasures such as the enemy's own mines. Cruisers, on the other hand, could carry plenty of mines and were pretty quick, but there weren't enough cruisers to spare, and losing one in such a mission would sting very badly. Given that laying mines in enemy waters was highly dangerous, it seemed unwise to use cruisers for this role, and then that left destroyers. Well, if they were converted to carry enough mines, they could be worthwhile, but they ended up sacrificing so much firepower to do this as to be practically unable to defend themselves if they were pursued by anything more aggressive than an armed trawler. Ships that were temporarily converted to the role also had their mines exposed on deck, which was never a good thing when you were possibly going to be under fire. And so a specification was drawn up for a so-called mine-laying cruiser. This would need to be fast enough to outrun surface ships easily, and this would in turn allow for most of the weapons carried to be anti-aircraft or at the very least dual-purpose weapons, and of course they'd have to carry a lot of mines, ideally under cover. The speed would also allow them to dart into range, deploy mines, and get out of range in the course of a single night. The result was a ship that displaced a little under 2,700 tons at standard displacement, which produced about as much power as the battlecruiser HMS Queen Mary, which had displaced an order of magnitude more. Throwing this ridiculous amount of power down a couple of shafts on such a light vessel gave a top speed, when lightly loaded, of around about 40 knots. This would allow the carriage of over 150 mines, which would launch out of 2 rear hatches, with the hull made flush deck in order to allow for the mines to be carried below and keep them protected from incidental fire and splinters. Guns would consist of 6 4-inch anti-aircraft guns in 3 twin mounts, with a pair super-firing forward and 1 aft, along with a single quad 40mm pom-pom and a scattering of 50 caliber machine guns. 4 ships were originally ordered: Abdiel, Latona, Manxman and Welshman, with 2 further ships to a slightly modified design, the Ariadne and Apollo, ordered after the outbreak of war. The last 2 differed from the first 4 in replacing the pom-pom with a pair of twin 40mm Bofors and dropping the super-firing 4-inch twin mount forward in order to save weight and space for new radar and fire control systems. Ariadne also added another Bofors twin mount in place of the lost B mounting, and Apollo appears to have occasionally experimented with having some form of light anti-aircraft weapon in that location at some points in its career. During the war, all the ships would receive a mixture of new air search, range-finding and fire control radars, and the inevitable outbreak of single and twin 20mm Oerlikons to augment their air defence. They turned out to actually work exceptionally well in their mine-laying role, but the mix of capabilities they had was such that people started finding all sorts of other jobs for them as well. They made especially good fast transports for men and supplies when heading to places like Tobruk and Malta, as the mine deck could carry a fair bit of other cargo when it wasn't carrying mines, and their sheer speed would let them run in and out of Axis air cover under optimal lighting and weather conditions, pretty much the same as if they'd been on a mining expedition. In this role, they would occasionally pretend to be one of the large French destroyers, something that their sheer size and speed quite lent itself to. 3 of the 6 ships would be lost, Latona having the shortest career, seeing about 6 months active service before being bombed by a Regia Aeronautica Junkers 87 in October 1941, whilst acting as a troop transport, with fire spreading to her magazines, although most of the troops and crew were able to make it to nearby destroyers before the explosion. Next to go was Welshman, which was torpedoed in February 1943 by the U-617, again whilst acting as a troop transport. Followed by Abdiel, which ironically hit mines in September 1943, again whilst serving as a transport. The 3 survivors saw service after World War II as their combination of speed and slightly above destroyer but not quite cruiser size rendered them highly useful in a number of secondary niche roles. Although Ariadne and Apollo would both be scrapped in the early 1960s, Manxman saw longer service, eventually ending up, again somewhat ironically, as a minesweeping command ship, and somewhere along the line picked up a story about her involvement in the Suez Crisis, which claims, at least, that on her way to join the fleet, she shadowed the American carrier group that was on its way to observe and put a significant amount of pressure on the Anglo-French operation. Annoyed by their tiny follower, the carrier group picked up speed. Manxman matched it, and soon the Leviathan form of the USS Coral Sea was pounding through the waves at flank speed, determined to rid itself and its escorts of the irritating Brit. Only to then see Manxman come flying past at its own considerably greater top speed, signal "See you in Egypt," and vanish over the horizon ahead. Whether or not that actually happened remains somewhat unclear and disputed, but it does sound like something the Royal Navy would do. Manxman would eventually go to the breaker's yard in the 1970s after a fire that broke out aboard her rendered her uneconomical to repair.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.